and it's good to see people back. I hope people are having a good morning. Today is the fourth and final session of The Man of Faith in the Age of AI, what Rav Joseph Soloveitchik can teach us about society, each other, and ourselves with Rabbi Levi Morrow. For today's session, returning to the broader questions of technology and human life, the fourth class will tackle Rav Soloveitchik's vision of the larger society within which the Jewish community exists by way of his classic article on interfaith relations, Confrontation. Confrontation famously concludes that dialogue across theological lines is impermissible. Indeed, it is impossible. Returning to the lonely man of faith's understanding of revelatory dialogue, however, may allow us to suggest a way forward for society, a redemptive solidarity that goes beyond mere technical cooperation, pointing to a shared redemptive future beyond any particular eschatology. For those who are not familiar, Rabbi Levi Morrow has smicha from the Shabar Sephardic Center. He's a PhD candidate at the Hebrew University of Yerushalayim, and he is researching Rav Soloveitchik's political theology. It's been a pleasure learning with him these past 4 weeks, as well as previous times in Dresha. And with that, and if you have questions for him at any point in class, if you're on Zoom, ask. If you can't ask, I can make it so you can ask, or you can ask in chat. And on Facebook, ask in chat. We do want to hear what you have to say. Questions make for a great learning environment. And with that, I want to hand things over to you. Have a good day.
Thank you very much, Kayla. Thank you for holding the logistics for this whole course. And thank you to Drisha again for the opportunity to teach. So this is the last of our 4-part course on being a modern Jew and a thinking person in the age of AI, when technology has a huge influence on our lives writ large, and AI is an important part of our current discourse as well. And looking at how Rav Soloveitchik can sort of help us think through those issues and the way they affect our lives. So I want to share a PowerPoint briefly, so we can take a look. I want to review very briefly what we've talked about so far, and then move into this week's topic. So as I have here, we have 3 classes. The first is technology as a human activity. The idea that we tend to talk about AI and even in technology as if they're just things that exist in the world, as opposed to things people are doing. And so I suggested that we should think of technology as a specific way of being human in the world, and a way of interacting with the world and thinking about the world, thinking about ourselves in the world, and that should shape how we interact with technology and AI. And the question is not like, what is AI and is it good or bad? Like, what are people doing, and do we think it's good or bad? And that's why questions around AI often come down to questions of like government regulation, right? We create regulations and government rules to encourage actions we think are good and discourage actions we think are bad. And if we think AI, and the things we call AI, the specific things that companies are making to serve whatever purposes are good or bad, then we should act accordingly. Class number 2, we talked about being a person is more than intelligence. That the phrase AI, artificial intelligence, is often used as part of asking, like, well, do they count as people? Should we be treating it like a person? And that is based on certain assumptions of what it means to be a person. That being a person is just, sort of the ability to absorb ideas and things from outside and spit them back out, maybe even recombining them. But it all stays on the level of questions of knowledge and what you know. And similar sort of discourse and this idea around what it means to be a person we found when you talk to people who say they want to, one day human beings will be able to upload our consciousness to the cloud or something like that, which is another idea of what it means to be a person, what it means to be conscious, as if it was data that could be uploaded, which I suggested based on Soloveitchik is simply not the case. And for Soloveitchik, the argument was that to be a person is to have deep commitments that go deeper than your reason and your intelligence and your sense of practicality. We talked about how there might be some parts of AI that might begin to qualify for that, something in terms of hardwiring and programming, but on the whole, not what we're dealing with in the moment. Last class we took this to God's personhood and its implications, the questions of what does it mean? Like we start with could an AI be God, as it were? It's like, well, we need to deal with the same sort of question about what does it mean to be a person, and that some of the arguments or trends towards talking about AI as if AI could be God are based on thinking of AI and God is super intelligent. And like, well, maybe God is actually just deeply committed to certain things. And so how that creates a model of thinking about keeping halakha and keep becoming part of a religious community that's based on openness to deep commitments on the parts of other people and the parts of God, right? And creating a community with room for also for deviance from that, which is where we ended off last time. But also his argument that to be a truly religious person, including sort of the religious value of humility, you need to be able to make space for other people to even not agree with you about religion or not live a religious life the way you think it should be lived. So with that, I want to we've gone sort of from technology to two classes on AI. I want to go back to technology and thinking in terms of technology. Um, and it's going to take us into his essay, Confrontation, which I'll introduce in a second. First, I want to talk a little bit about the basic dichotomy of technology. For Rav Soloveitchik is technology versus values. And in the language of Lonely Man of Faith, it's Adam the first versus Adam the second. You have technology, values, success versus sacrifice, wordiness versus the wordless. Right? He says that the technical community in society people can always talk to each other versus the difficulty of expressing your sort of deep commitments. You have reason versus faith and commitments and emotions, your society versus the individual, the universal versus the particular, and dignity finally versus redemption. And just to linger on that last line for a minute, he talks about dignity in two ways that we saw. One is the ability of the individual person or of society to redeem ourselves from our squalor, right? The idea that he says people who can create airplanes and fly between Boston and New York or fly to the moon or make hospitals and medicines are just much more dignified than people who can't, right? So you imagine the human race and all of the diseases and that ended human life much earlier and made human life in general much less pleasant 200 years ago. Like it's just less dignified than what it means to be a human now, he would say. And similarly, he says dignity is always social, that it's always you experience yourself as dignified because other people see you as such. That to be dignified is to be seen in a certain way. Redemption, he says, is also to be seen in a certain way, but it is to experience redemptive dialogue. We spoke about last time, to be having a sort of conversation with someone where you manage to actually express the things you really care about and where they are able to hear that from you really and accept you and see you. And that is a form of redemption. So that set of dichotomies is going to walk with us into confrontation, which I'll introduce in a second. And then we will talk about towards the end, for the second part of the class, how that might be problematized. The tight binary he sort of makes here and he's going to make in confrontation, I think ultimately doesn't hold up even on his own terms. So we talked about that a little last time about reading Rav Soloveitchik against himself, and we're going to do that again here. So briefly, Confrontation is an article he publishes in I think 1965. Yeah. It is on interfaith or interreligious dialogues. It was 1964. And it was in response to what's called Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, where the Vatican, over a number of years, organized groups of theologians and bishops and to come together and talk about a variety of theological issues, a variety of innovations that they would propose and discuss. But one of them was about like forgiving the Jews for killing their God. And we're not going to see it inside, but Soloveitchik's basic response to that was he says like, well, that seems like a them problem. Like if they want to forgive us, great, but we don't need to get involved with that. But alongside Vatican II, there was a rising sense in America of interfaith dialogue being a valuable thing to be engaged in. Groups of Christians and groups of Jews coming together to talk about their religions. And Rav Soloveitchik is going to reject that in part. I have down here the third note that he says yes to universal human dialogue, no to particular faith dialogue. And we'll come around to what exactly that means. And then finally, we'll ask, how does this go together with Lonely Man of Faith? This book I have over here on the right is a very recently published book by Karma Ben Yochanan, interesting researcher, about basically the way Jews responded to Vatican II. in America, and like how that which is a great section on Rav Soloveitchik. The book itself is broadly recommended. Okay, so that is the confrontation. That is what we've seen so far. Let's jump into some text to talk about. Okay, so the basic question I've started with here is, can we build a better world together? We meet different religious, cultural, political groups, but also how does cooperation work? What are its conditions and prerequisites, right? That Soloveitchik, we saw throughout Lonely Man of Faith how he talks about faith in a way that could be expanded well beyond religion. Like we talked a lot about commitment more than about specific dogmas or ideas. That deep commitment to specifically religious ideas, to God, to prayer, things like that, are what make it faith. But he talks in terms of commitment more broadly. And the same is going to be true of confrontation. He's going to lay out an argument for what it means to be engaged in group-to-group dialogue that is about religious groups, but a lot of it could be about sort of any sort of groups. Is very much going to be built on that same sort of the obscure way he slides between commitment and faith. So a group that's committed to faith is a religious group, but other groups are just other kinds of groups. So we're going to talk about that. First, we're going to jump into a couple of paragraphs that I've selected from the beginning of Confrontation, which requires a word about its form. This is one of the many, many times Rav Soloveitchik came back to the first 3 chapters of Sefer Bereshit, right? Where he wants to give a reading of sorts of what it means to be human and try to make an argument about human nature by examining the story of Adam Harishon and Chava, and then in Confrontation he even goes all the way out to Noach, and later in Confrontation to Esav and Yaakov. He is pretty fully engaged with biblical text here. We're going to look at some sections from where he says what is the sin of Adam Harishon and the relationship of Adam and Chava. So he says, all too often, the motivating force in creative man is not the divine mandates entrusted to him, and which must be implemented in full at both levels, the cognitive and the normative, but a demonic urge for power. And a confrontation has the same sort of sense that he puts forward in Lonely Man of Faith, that to be human is part of what it means to be human is to be given reason and the ability to understand your reality. There's the cognitive and the normative, that you can try and make the world the way you think it should be. The reason for failure of confronted man to play his role fully lies in the fact that while the cognitive gesture gives mastery and a sense of success, the normative gesture requires a man's surrender. He says we don't actually always succeed in fulfilling that destiny because it is twofold. It means once we should we can have the ability to master the world, but also we should need to recognize our own limits, and that's not something that's necessarily inherent to reason. At this juncture, man of today commits the error which his ancestor, Adam of old, committed by lending an attentive ear to the demonic whisper, you shall be as God, knowing good and evil. That he says modern man, in modern technological successful man, perpetuates and just repeats the sin of Adam Harishon, which was, as he says, about a form of mastery, by saying we can do what we think will create the best life for us, independent of moral norms or commandments that we may or may not agree with. So he moves. That's the first level he wants to build in confrontation. He builds from just existing to having, he calls, confronted man, to doubly confronted. And the first confrontation is I have the ability to use reason to understand my world and potentially to exceed what moral limits I may or may not be I may or may not feel necessary to follow. And the confrontation there is a confrontation of man and the world, humanity and the world. And it just means sort of turning and being face to face with the world. You go from being, he says, sort of a not conscious of the world at all, to suddenly being aware of the world. Then the second one is going to be moving up from being aware of the world to also being aware of other people. And he says, what happens when we try and engage with other people? The hope of finding a personal existential equation of 2 human beings is rooted in the dangerous and false notion that human existences are abstract magnitudes subject to the simple mathematical processes, right? And that you can hear sort of the image of what it means to be a person that he rejected in Lonely Man of Faith as purely knowledge, as just this sort of raw data model. It is paradoxical, yet nonetheless true that each human being lives both in an existential community, surrounded by friends, and in a state of existential loneliness and tension, confronted by strangers. Because this is what it means to be a person, is to be both social and lonely, even when you live in a community, right? In an existential community, a community that really is a place of like deep fulfillment and everyone is engaged with each other in some way. There's still a way in which you can never sort of fully join that community. In each to whom I relate as a human being, I find a friend, for we have many things in common, as well as a stranger, for each of us is unique and wholly other. This otherness stands in the way of complete mutual understanding. Of course, there prevails quite often a harmony of interests, economic, political, social, upon which two individuals focus their attention. However, two people glancing at the same object may continue to lead isolated, closed-in existences. Coordination of interests does not spell an existential union. Right, so that's what he talked about in Living of Faith as like the political community or the work community, that you can have a kind of community that's based on harmony of interests. We all want the same thing, we cooperate to get it. But it's even in a deeper community, a community where we hope to appreciate even the non-instrumental, non-utilitarian parts of other people. There's some sense in which we have a hard time. There's never a total meshing of the community. We remain individuals. And for him, what that points to is the impossibility of dialogue. He says there's some way in which dialogue between two people is fundamentally impossible. And we're going to come back to that. But the distinction he wants to make here is it's impossible to have dialogue on the things that make us unique. Things that make us unique, the other person simply won't be able to understand. But the things that we share, the common interests, the sort of the world in which we live, there we can have total communal meshing. It works totally fine. Modern man who did not meet to the fullest the challenge of confrontation on the second level does not perform well at the level of personal confrontation either, right? If the sin of eating from the tree of life, tree of knowledge, was the failure at the first level of insisting on domination rather than accepting limits, the same thing happens at the level of interpersonal engagement, right? That the engagement between Adam and Chava, and Adam and Eve, also involves some sort of failure. He's developed the habit of confronting his fellow man in a fashion similar to that which prevails at the level of the subject-object relationship, and seeking to dominate and subordinate him instead of communicating and communing with him. Right? The relationship between two people ends up not being about dialogue and communication, but about domination and subordination. The wondrous personal confrontation of Adam and Eve is thus turned into an ugly attempt at depersonalization. As a matter of fact, the divine curse addressed to Eve after she sinned, "V'hu Shalbach," and he shall rule over thee, has found its fulfillment in modern society, right? What starts as a curse or some sort of punishment in the third chapter of Bereshit becomes the state of modern Western society for Rav Soloveitchik. The modern Western society is based on domination throughout. So that's his basic picture of what dialogue is. Right? The dialogue is a process of mutual understanding, of trying to come to understand each other better and create some sort of community together. And he says it runs into problems when you realize there are parts of people that just aren't understandable, that don't fit into rational categories in easy ways. Like, why does someone care so deeply about, their religion, whatever their deep commitments are? There it's sort of a gumming up of the works of dialogue. It's where communication fails, or rational understanding of each other fails. And he says that is something that you have to make room for. That matters for the topic of interfaith dialogue, because he's going to make an analogy. So basically the same way that people all have something that makes them unique and individual, so too faith communities, right? Communities based around these sort of commitments also have things that make them individual and not capable of full, perfect dialogue. And he's going to lay it out in this paragraph I'll read with these sort of three characteristics of what are the things each community has that can't be translated to another community. As there cannot be an equation between two individuals unless they are converted into abstractions, it is likewise absurd to speak of the commensurability of two faith communities, which are individual entities. The individuality of a faith community expresses itself in a threefold way. First, the divine imperatives and commandments to which a faith community is unreservedly committed must not be equated with the ritual and ethos of another community, right? You shouldn't say, oh, well, the Jews keep Shabbat and the Christians have their Sabbath, which, might be derived from Shabbat, because they're fundamentally different. You shouldn't try and put them together. To speak nothing of like non-Abrahamic religions, like the comparison often made to particularly for Israelis, where a lot of religious Israelis will go to India and study Buddhism and Hinduism and things for years, will often be inclined to compare between different rituals in the communities. And he's saying like you shouldn't even try. It's they each function differently within their community. Everyone is committed to their sets of mitzvot. You shouldn't try and turn them into abstractions that might be equatable. Each faith community is engaged in a singular normative gesture, reflecting the numinous nature of the act of faith itself, and is fuel to try to find common denominators, particularly when we speak of the Jewish faith community, whose very essence is expressed in the halachic performance, which is its most individuating factor. Any attempt to equate our identity with one another is sheer absurdity. So that's the first, right? The specific actions you believe in doing. Second, the axiological awareness. And axiological words, the word Rav Soloveitchik likes to use, just means values, right? The sense of the awareness of value of each faith community is an exclusive one, where it believes, and this belief is indispensable to the survival of the community, that its system of dogmas, doctrines, and values is best fitted for the attainment of the ultimate good, right? And this is sort of true, again, for any kind of community, that you have to believe in the value of your community in order for it to continue to exist. Right? So if your community is defined by certain doctrines, values, and dogmas, then you have to believe those are valuable. And if no one in your community thinks those things are valuable, it's just going to go away. It's going to stop existing because you're not going to keep doing it and perpetuating it, right? So communities, he says, have to be allowed to believe that they themselves are good. Third, each faith community is unyielding in its eschatological expectations. And eschatology from the Greek eschaton just means, talking about or thinking about the end times, right? What the world will be like in the redeemed future. It perceives the events of the end of time with exultant certainty and expects man, by surrender of selfish pettiness and by consecration to the great destiny of life, to embrace the faith that this community has been preaching throughout the millennia. Standardization of practices, equalization of dogmatic certitudes, and the waiving of eschatological claims spell the end of the vibrant and great faith experiences of any religious community. Right, so the last one is that the sort of same way that people are allowed or should be allowed to believe in the value of their own, faith, so too they should be allowed to believe that, like, if there was an ideal situation, which is sort of what the end of times means functionally, if everything was the best way it could be, then everyone would do this. Like that would make sense. So that's the three categories that make any faith community who they are. The same way a person is only really fully a person when they're embracing their deep qualities, their deep commitments that transcend rationality, that transcend the universalizable, that which can be expressed in words. So too, when any faith community is sort of fully itself, when it has these three characteristics, the specific sets of rituals, the belief in its own value, and the belief that like one day that value will be realized. Its greatest visions will be realized. Is you can't take those away from any sort of community. And he says there is no contradiction between coordinating our cultural activity with all men at the same time confronting them as members of another faith community. And he says there's always going to be two parts to what he calls the confrontation, right? Two parts to dialogue, and one of those works and one of those doesn't. As a matter of fact, even within the non-Jewish society, each individual sees himself as under a double aspect. First, as a member of a cultural creative community in which all are committed to a common goal, and at the same time as an individual living in seclusion and loneliness, right? This is just a feature of what it means to be a human being, is to always be torn between community and your own isolation from that community. And it's true in what you might call the community of communities, right? Whether it's the world, like a broader world that made up of religious communities or the community of nations, no matter what, the individual will feel some ways in which they meld into the community and some ways in which they do not. So based on all of that, this leads Rav Soloveitchik to just like a practical conclusion about the possibility of interfaith dialogue, right? Is the word of faith reflects the intimate, the private, the paradoxically inexpressible cravings of the individual, and for his linking up with his maker, right? Faith is that space where dialogue breaks down. The strangeness of the act of faith of a particular community, which is totally incomprehensible to the man of a different faith community, the confrontation should not occur at a theological, but a mundane human level, right? So if faith is exactly sort of the area of the inexpressible and where dialogue breaks down, then dialogue should happen only when areas that don't have to do with faith. There, all of us speak the universal language of modern man, right? We all share this ability to talk to each other. As a matter of fact, our common interests lie not in the realm of faith, but in that of the secular orders. There, we all face a powerful antagonist. We all have to contend with a considerable number of matters of great concern. The relationship between two communities must be outward directed and related to the secular orders with which men of faith come face to face. If the powerful community of many feels like remedying an embarrassing human situation or redressing a historic wrong, it should do so at the human ethical level. However, if the debate should revolve around matters of faith, then one of the confronters will be impelled to avail himself of the language of his opponent. This in itself would mean surrender of individuality and distinctiveness, right? So that you should maintain a distinction between what it means to participate in society versus what it means to have your own separate communal faith. And only on the first one can you have dialogue between communities, right? And he ends up coming around to here, if the powerful community of the many. It refers to Christianity in America. So American Christians want to redress this historic wrong and just forgive Jews for the crime that they attribute to us. Great, that's fine. And if you want to have some sort of human ethical level component of that, you want to do something practical with Jews, great. But it shouldn't be in a theological conversation where he says you end up having to force individuality and distinctiveness into the language of your opponent, right? Into the language of the other person in the conversation. And I'll note that this confrontation has become a site of discussion just historically for like what would he still say today? What are the allowances? Because as I mentioned before, at least one of the times he gave the classes underlying the Lonely Man of Faith, right? The classes that became the book was to a mixed Jewish Christian audience. He happily cites Christian theologians sometimes. So where are the lines here is not something super clear. And like one suggestion, I think this is from a student Rabbi David Hartman, I don't remember, that maybe in Israel things would be different, where the phrase the powerful community of the many would refer not to Christians but to Jews. Maybe then it would be different. We're not going to head in that direction. I want to talk about a different possibility we'll get to, but that is the basic picture conversation gives us, right? There's two parts of any human being, and therefore also two parts of what it means to be a community, whether that is a faith community, which would be Jewish, whether it's any specific Jewish community within the broader Jewish world. Like he draws these same lines in some of his letters where he talks about Orthodox communities cooperating with conservative and Reform communities. And I should just put on the table that he is a leader of Orthodox Jews in America at a time of great invective against non-Orthodox communities. He at one point says it'd be better to totally miss hearing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah than to hear the shofar in a conservative synagogue. Thankfully, most of those fights have sort of died down, as I can tell. But it's worth saying that he is part of that fight. But he's, in the sense, there's a way in which that means he gives each community within the broader Jewish world the ability to be its own community. This is we are happy, just like we are happy to work with any other community on any practical issue, but everyone involved should get to hold on to their own values and their own sense of what their community is about. So I've done quite a bit so far. I would love to see if there are any questions. I'm going to stop sharing for a second. I'm happy to keep going, but this has been the basic idea of confrontation, which is worth, again, sort of pausing on.
And if you can't unmute yourself, don't want to unmute yourself, please pass me a question in chat, and I'm happy to bring it up to Rabbi Morrow.
Okay, seems like everyone's holding for now, and I trust that everyone's with me. So let's jump into the next text, and then we'll again see how this how if anyone really would like to clarify anything, I'm happy to. This is called the addendum to the original edition of Confrontation. I think it published a little bit later, right? It was really published in 1967, or a little later, it was republished in 1967. And here he goes through, tries to again make clearer what exactly he thinks you can talk about, what you cannot, and he again traces out more clearly this binary that we've been discussing. Is in the areas of universal concern, we welcome an exchange of ideas and impressions. Communication among various communities will greatly contribute towards mutual understanding. It will enhance and deepen our knowledge of those universal aspects of man which are relevant to all of us. In the area of faith, religious law, and doctrine and ritual, Jews have throughout the ages been a community guided exclusively by distinctive concerns, ideals, and commitments. Our love of and dedication to God are personal and bespeak an intimate relationship which must not be debated with others whose relationship to God has been molded by different historical events and in different terms. Discussion will in no way enhance or hallow those emotions. We therefore oppose to any public debate, dialogue, or symposium concerning the doctrinal, dogmatic, or ritual aspects of our faith vis-a-vis similar aspects of another faith community. We believe in and are committed to our Maker in a specific manner. We will not question, defend, offer apologies, analyze, or rationalize our faith in dialogues centered around these private topics which express our personal relationship to the God of Israel. We assume that members of other faith communities will feel similarly about their individual religious commitment. We would deem it improper to enter into dialogues on such topics as Judaic monotheism, the Christian idea of Trinity, the Messianic idea in Judaism and Christianity, the Jewish attitude on Jesus, the concept of the covenant in Judaism and Christianity, the Eucharist, Mass, and Jewish prayer service, the Holy Ghost and prophetic inspiration, Isaiah and Christianity, the priest and the rabbi, sacrifice and the Eucharist, the church and synagogue, their sanctity, metaphysical nature, etc. Right? A whole host of theological topics he doesn't want to get into. He said members of faith communities will feel similarly about their own religious community commitments, right? All members of all faiths communities, he's saying, should be okay and be allowed to, hold on to their own beliefs without having to try and put them into other people's language. There cannot be mutual understanding concerning these topics, for Jew and Christian will employ different categories and move within commensurate frames of reference and evaluation. When, however, we move from the private world of faith to the public world of humanitarian and cultural endeavors, communication among the various faith communities is desirable and even essential. He says we actually should be able to work together on a variety of topics that are of concern to religious communities, right? All religious communities are going to care about them. We'll get to them in a second, but they're not specifically theological. We are ready to enter into dialogue on topics such as war and peace, poverty, freedom, man's moral values, the threat of secularism. I know that this was written in the 1960s. I remember hearing once Rabbi Dr. Shai held remarking that some of the American Jewish theologians of the 20th century are deeply concerned with the threat of secularism and aren't as ready for the way in the 21st century religion itself may become a source of violence. It's sort of separate discussion. It's technology and which is our topic, and human values, civil rights, etc., right, which revolve around religious, spiritual aspects of our civilization. Discussion within these areas will, of course, be within the framework of our religious outlooks and terminology. So this text works with the binary in many ways of universal concern versus the distinctive ideas of the community and our commitments, the public and the world of humanitarian cultural endeavors versus the private world of faith. But so that's in some ways very much the same as confrontation, saying this is just like he's fleshing out what he meant by confrontation, right? In confrontation, he said we can talk about these things and we can't talk about these things, right? Simple as that. But I want to draw our attention to the last line here, and this is going to help us lead into Lonely Man of Faith. This is all of these things that we can talk about, right? These are the things that are ostensibly humanitarian and cultural endeavors, right? So they revolve about spiritual aspects of our civilization, right? They actually are, in fact, religious and spiritual in some sense. And discussing within these areas will, of course, be within the framework of our religious outlooks and terminology. That he's actually set up this dichotomy and then sort of said maybe it doesn't hold up entirely. Maybe there is a sense in which, like when we talk about technology, we do so from a religious perspective, right? I'm giving now the fourth of a series of classes about technology through the theological writings of Rav Soloveitchik, right? As if we are religious people, this won't always be possible. We can't set aside, this part of ourselves all the time. So That's going to be what we talk about. Sort of the rest of this class is going to be about problematizing this dichotomy he set up so far based on his own writings. The way even in his own writings, it starts to fall apart. And I call this dialogue across difference, lonely man of faith against confrontation. Again, just pause for a second. If anyone has any questions so far, with me.
I'll just make a comment,
Yes.
and there needs to be like some sort of like addendum or response to this. I'm not sure who would write it about the current state of affairs in the world, which seems to be like a monkey wrench in a lot of this. For example, the whole notion of oppressor versus oppressed, um, modern war technology, international relations, Israel as um, I'll use the word bête noire, but it's worse than that. And it just seems like it pulls the rug out under a lot of the topics and conceptions that seem to underlie this article and some of the thinking, the Rav's thinking.
Okay, so this is one of the things I would like love to get into a half-hour conversation about. We'll come back to some of this. The last two texts I have on the source sheet are about the state and international law as he puts them as forms of technology, but I want to talk about the way, even with some of the other conceptions, that might not make sense. But I agree with you. A lot of this scans much better in the 1960s than it does in the 2020s. But it's its own series of classes. We'd love to talk about that at some other time. Okay, so I'll jump back into our sources. Okay, so the first thing is we had two sources here, source number 7 and source number 8. We'll go through them, but they're from chapter 8 of the Lone Man of Faith, which is where he just says the whole dichotomies he's been laying out this whole time. Ideally, that dichotomy doesn't hold up. Like ideally, for various ways, and he gives a couple different explanations, that should fall apart. And so a way halacha, he thinks, actually pulls that apart. And he says the halacha believes there is only one world, not divisible into secular and hallowed sectors, right? And he earlier in Confrontation referred to secular orders versus sort of universal human culture. These can either plunge into ugliness and hatefulness or be roused to meaningful redeeming activity, gathering up all latent powers into a state of holiness. Right? He says that halacha's vision is one of, much like he said sort of in this piece from the addendum, where from within our own religious perspective, we engage with the broader world. Accordingly, the task of covenantal man is to be engaged not in dialectical surging forward and retreating, but in uniting the two communities into one community, where man is both the creative free agent and the obedient servant of God. Right? The vision is of a community that's both a natural political work community and a religious community, a faith community. Notwithstanding the huge disparity between these two communities, which expresses itself in the typological oppositions and conflicts described previously, halacha sees in the ethical moral norm a uniting force. The norm, which originates in the covenantal community, addresses itself almost exclusively to the majestic community where its realization takes place. To use a metaphor, I would say that the norm, in the opinion of halacha, is the tentacle by which the covenant, like ivy, attaches itself to and spreads over the world of majesty. The basic idea he's trying to capture here, this whole discussion of the ethical moral norm, is that it doesn't make sense to talk about technology and values because values are always manifest in like in the world in some way. If you have values and you're not trying to put them into practice or action in some way, then they're not really your values. Your values are only values when they're manifest in practice, right? And there's a reading that I am very partial to the Lonely Man of Faith, where like Adam the First is purely the bad guy. But there's a good article, I don't remember, I think it was about Alex Student or something, but recently saying like, oh, you don't get ethics without Adam the First. You don't get ethics without engaging in the world based on those values. That the this is the ivy attaching and spreading over the world of majesty, that values are supposed to be everywhere in the world. It should never have a part of the world that's walled off from values. But at the same time, the ivy, if it doesn't have a world to be, held up on, to exist on, it just collapses on the floor. Or ivy crawls up around the outside of physical structures and can't live without them. The same way values need to be manifest in the world, are only manifest in the world if you have actions, including technology, right? If you're going to, try and create a better world based on your values, that's what he called technology. And this is from a footnote where he says here, the unqualified acceptance of the world of majesty by halacha expresses itself in the natural and inevitable involvement in every sector of human majestic endeavor. The part of the way this works out is that halacha just thinks like being technology is great and like being involved in the world is great. There is not a single theoretical or technological discovery, from new psychological insights into the human personality to a man's attempts to reach out among the planets. I'll note again that this is in the early 60s, and he talks about space travel just all over the book, with which halacha is not concerned. New halachic problems arise with every new scientific discovery, right? Every time we gain a new thing we know about the world, but also we gain a new thing we can do in the world, that raises new ethical questions, new value questions. As a matter of fact, at present, in order to render precise halachic decisions in many fields of human endeavor, one must possess, besides excellent halachic training, a good working knowledge in those secular fields in which the problem occurs. Its acceptance, easily proven in regard to the total majestic gesture, is most pronounced in halachic relationship to scientific medicine and the act of healing. So that like you can just see also that halacha requires you to know about all these different parts of the world because it has this relationship of ivy to the wall that ivy lives on, where in order for halacha to be what it is, it must also be attached to real world science and medicine and things like that, right? So this is a very different picture from the binaries and dichotomies we talked about at the beginning, right? All the ones of lowly man of faith, but also of confrontation. And that means we have to ask the basic dichotomy of confrontation of, yes, you can talk about human things, and no, you can't talk about Jewish things, right? You can talk about secular things, but not religious things. Does that even make sense? And like the basic claim of there's these parts of ourselves we can't bring into conversation actually flies in the face of some stuff we saw last week. We're going to see some of I think text number 10 here is one we saw before, but that in fact the idea of lowly man of faith, of dialogue, of redemptive dialogue, is exactly about the things you can't talk about, right? Lowly man of faith, like confrontation, assumes that there are things that you cannot express to another person, that you can't put them into words in a way the other person will just obviously understand them. And then Adam, I should just read source number 10, because we're talking. If God had not joined the community of Adam and Eve, they would never have been able to, would never have cared to make the paradoxical leap over the gap, indeed abyss, separating two individuals whose personal experiential messages are written in a private code undecipherable by anyone else, right? So it starts the same picture as confrontation of Adam and Eve as radically different individuals and the impossibility of dialogue between them. But God joins the community. Without the covenantal experience of prophetic or prayerful colloquy, conversation coming together, Adam absconditus would have persisted in his he role and Eve absconditus in her she role, unknown to and distant from each other. Only when God emerged from the transcendent darkness of he anonymity into the illumined spaces of communal knowability and charged man with an ethical and moral mission, did Adam absconditus and Eve abscondita, while revealing themselves to God in prayer and in unqualified commitment, also reveal themselves to each other in sympathy and love on the one hand, and in common action on the other. Thus, the final objective of the human quest for redemption was attained. The individual felt relieved from loneliness and isolation. The community of the committed became ipso facto a community of friends, not of neighbors or acquaintances. Friendship, not as a social surface relationship, but an existential in-depth relation between two individuals, is realizable only within the framework of the covenantal community, where in-depth personalities relate themselves to each other ontologically, and total commitment to God and fellow man is the order of the day. Right, so he has this vision that there is a real possibility. It's necessarily a divine or miraculous possibility, but there is a possibility for people to understand each other or to enter into relationship with each other, even across gaps that shouldn't be crossable, right? You can make all the arguments you want that there's parts of ourselves that other people can't fully understand, but he says sometimes it happens. Sometimes you're having a conversation with someone and you manage to open up to them. We talked last time about the way that's structured in Line of Faith is around the question of, can we accept in ourselves and then can we accept in other people the things that don't make sense to us? That it's not just about like, oh, we're talking and suddenly I managed to understand something I didn't understand before. It's recognizing that dialogue as an act of understanding, of trying to understand the other person, is a very limited, narrow way of thinking about dialogue. that dialogue as engaging with and encountering the other person also means having space for the parts of the person that you can't understand and might never understand, and being okay with that. And that paints a very different other sort of picture of dialogue writ large, right? If we imagine that dialogue is about mutual understanding and trying to create mutual understanding in the context of interfaith dialogue, he's saying that'll never work because there's parts of the communities that will never be able to understand each other. But if you see the dialogue as being not just about mutual understanding, but also about creating a community together, right? This is what he says here. You end up with this community where it's not just about Adam and Eve coming together in a two individual person-to-person dialogue, and that works. This is only when they're part of a broader community where they recognize their own context and recognize existing alongside each other, even in ways they don't understand it all the time. Then it's possible for them to really understand each other, for that to really make space for each other in that way. And that's the language of making space. I was noticing he uses here as well. He borrowed from the Kabbalistic idea of tzimtzum, but this is from an essay called The Community. And I won't go into it inside, but he says simply the act of tzimtzum, of self-limitation and self-contraction, which is in the sort of Kabbalistic story of how God created the world. God created the world first by creating a space for everything other than God. That is fundamentally what it means to create a community for Rav Soloveitchik. It's the first act of community is you withdraw and you make space for someone outside yourself. And this is a very different way of thinking about it than in confrontation. Confrontation in some ways is a very narrow way of thinking about interpersonal engagement, where it's purely about, can I rationally understand the other person? And the answer is no. There is always going to be a break, a necessary stop in the process of understanding, where we have to say, okay, we can't talk there. And in Lonely Man of Faith, Rav Soloveitchik might say, well, we can't talk there, but we can be engaged with each other in a way that goes beyond talking, like in some form of acceptance and living alongside and solidarity and working together and that sort of thing. That the image of a community of nations or a community of religious communities, something like that. And like the fact that religious communities from across the spectrum in America cooperate on what they consider to be sort of religious freedom issues is, I think, a good example of what he would have liked to see, per se. That you can imagine that, like, oh, we don't agree on the theology we're dealing with here, but it work, like we can all work together to accomplish ends together. Like, that works. There's one more section of the shir, but I love this has been in some ways the main part of this is where I wanted to get to, the image of redemption. I'll turn a little bit to the language of redemption that he uses in Lonely Man of Faith and in Confrontation. That in Confrontation, we talked about how for him, each community has to be allowed to have its own eschatological expectations, its own vision of what a redeemed future would look like. But in Lonely Man of Faith, redemption is about recognizing that other people have other values, and that's okay. And that you can create a redeemed community, a community wherein redemption is experienced exactly by making space for other people's values and for other people's visions of what the future should look like. And so the interfaith dialogue based on Lonely Man of Faith would be exactly that, to say recognizing other communities, again, faith communities or political communities and ethnic communities and whatever kind of communities he wants to talk about as being very different. And that's okay. And we can live alongside each other with all our own specific individual visions of redeemed future. And by virtue of accepting different futures all together, have some sort of redeemed present.
If I can just step in with a comment.
Yeah.
In source 10, it was interesting to hear the phrase hold space being as a translation of tzimtzum. That particular phrase I hear come up in a lot of places related to community building contemporarily. And while, again, it is a phrase about like making space for other people and using it and acknowledgement of the other to build community, but it comes across very differently. And that is something I'm now going to be like, okay, now I'm going to be thinking about Rav Soloveitchik in some of these contexts, which will be sometimes interesting, sometimes slightly irrelevant.
Yeah, I think it's a very useful phrase. He also used the term sacrifice, but I think it's in the sense of like exactly that, like stepping back and leaving space open for someone else. It's to him the fundamental act of creating community, right? Much deeper than mutual understanding. If there's no other comments right now, I'll take a couple minutes to slide into the broader questions of the world as a whole as we might want to create it. Here called the state and international law as technologies, question mark, right? So he, in the Lowly Man of Faith, is very explicit about this. So Adam the first wants to work, produce, and succeed in his undertakings. He must unite with others. The whole theory of the social contract brought to perfection by the philosophers of the Age of Reason reflects the thinking of Adam the first, identifying man with his intellectual nature and creative technological will, and finding in human existence coherence, legitimacy, and reasonableness exclusively. And he says that what it means, that the idea of the social contract of the state is you can create the state as a tool to get us what we need. He thinks it's a very sort of reductive understanding of human nature. But elsewhere, he does say that's what he thinks states are for. States are this practical thing. And part of that's why he thinks you can't ever just have a state. You also have to have religious communities within the state because people have depth commitments and will come together in faith communities and communities of commitments and that sort of thing. But the state is fundamentally a tool for realizing success in human life. And I think that's just not the only way to think about it, particularly as we talk about in like nationalist contexts as opposed to liberal social contract contexts. But more broadly, states are sites of sacrifice. People sacrifice for other members of their state. That's part of what it means to belong to a state, is that you think, whether in the form of military service and like the risk of real bodily sacrifice, or on the small level of taxes and following the law, like to participate in a state is to accept limits on yourself, to make space for other people by self-limitation in a way that is just not captured in this paragraph. And the same thing is true of this is from Majesty and Humility, a small article of his, where he lays out the same sort of dichotomies we talked about this whole time, Adam 1, Adam 2. He refers to as a manifestation of this sort of practical, reasonable way of thinking about the universe. Grotius' theory of jus gentium, of it means the laws of the nations, because a Roman political theorist, the idea that international law is a form of rational technology, basically. And that's one way of thinking about it, much like the state might be a way of thinking of the state as a tool, as a technology for making our life better as individual citizens. The international law could be a way of thinking, oh, this is how we're going to create a good society, or a good society of size, the international community. But another way of thinking about it, and there's much to commend this, is the international law is just a bunch of states saying, here's ways in which we're willing to not exert all our rights and not assert all our rights, that we, or not assert all our powers, per se. Like we as states could do more things that we're going to self-limit and not do, right? This is fundamentally what international law is in some ways, is that states agreeing to follow certain rules. And that seems like much more of a Adam the Two sacrifice model of community than the technological Adam the First model. So that is, I think he gives us two options for thinking about this area, thinking about like the broad scale of our community, of our universe, of the world we live in, right? You can think about the world we live in on the political levels as tools for making our lives better. You can also think about ways in which we try and create a better world independent of ourselves, in ways that might ask a real sacrifice of us. And so that is, I think, where we're at in the age of AI through the lens of Rav Soloveitchik. Thank you guys so much all for joining me. If there's any more questions, we have a couple more minutes. I'm happy to hang out. Yeah.
Again, just a little comment. So we have a state in the United States called Alabama, and the justices in Alabama have taken a particular narrow view of Christianity and declared that a zygote is a person. And it seems like there is really no room within, I'm going to call it the judicial technological nexus here, to do anything really about that. And it just seems, again, like there's all kinds of confrontations and dichotomies that arise from all of this. And American law, however it's getting expressed these days, seem to, be in confrontation with a lot of these ideas of social contracts and making space, and it seems like the religious political environment doesn't allow for that currently.
So I'll say a couple things. One, I appreciate your use of the word confrontation. Two is, yeah, he's very, like, in some ways, part of the reason he wants to maintain this binary is because he's skeptical of the ways in which, I would say, like, the active attempt to create a state based on certain commitments can be ethical. It can involve necessarily, like we saw last time, the religious, he said, from a religious perspective, you need to recognize that other people aren't going to have your religious values. And if you don't do that, you end up with the Crusades and the Inquisition, right? What that means is that you shouldn't use religious values to determine the way everyone has to behave in a space. And so he doesn't believe in states because he thinks we can create a good world with them. Like, he thinks that there is something to that. There's a way we technologically do so, but he also thinks we can't, that, like, if you didn't have states, you'd have people killing each other in religious wars without states. Like, he does thinks you can't get religious wars, non-religious wars. Like, he just thinks you can't get away from the problem of violence. So states are the best tools we have, he thinks, for avoiding violence on mass scales. And therefore, you should, like, we should have states and not abuse them. And he would say that, like, the attempt to enforce your religious values via the state is a sort of a corruption of both of those things, an incorrect blurring of the lines that, as I've noted, he does blur. But, like, part of the reasons he doesn't want to blur them is because he's worried about exactly the sort of thing.
And a lot of people here as well, they're worried
Yeah.
about it.
I'm still kind of trying to put together both the wanting to hold back and make community and be and is what in line with confrontation, because there are, say, how am I trying to put this? It's one thing to try and, like, make space for other things, for others to build a community, but, like, there are boundaries. And in confrontation, Rav Soloveitchik seems to kind of put up a pretty solid boundary. And I'm thinking, like, oh, like, okay, that has, maybe has real world, like, this isn't just like an individual thing. There's Rav Soloveitchik had some institutional weight in his lifetime, more than some. And so saying, okay, that's nice, that's nice on Vatican II, but that's a you thing. I, as someone who's institutionally involved, am going to make a point that, like, maybe that's wrong thing. That's the wrong way to put it. Like, Rav Soloveitchik's opinions on Vatican II may have had some, like, real practical implications for the institutions that he had influence in. And I'm thinking, so it's like, okay, what do you do when you individual or you institutional or you state do when there's a boundary that you will not, like, not this time, run into? I may just not be holding enough in Rav Soloveitchik's philosophical thought for what comes next.
No, I think the question that he would say you have to ask, and there is no, like, across the board answer to how this looks, but
Yeah.
is, at what point would you be giving up on one of your commitments, your sort of basic faith commitments, versus when are you giving up on, like, your, like, power, like your institutional space, something like that, like something that's let's say, things that are fundamental to your community versus things that are just features of any community. So, like, sharing physical space with another community might be fine in ways that, like, giving up on your own dialogue, on your own beliefs, it would not. Yeah, it's a good question, but I don't think there's also, like, a single answer for it, and that's the question that he would ask, to how you'd proceed.
Mm-hmm. All right. I'm not seeing any questions come up on Facebook chat, but
okay. Well, then I guess, yeah. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you, Rabbi Morrow. Thank you, everyone, for coming back for these weeks. I hope you enjoyed learning with him, and take this with you. Have a good day, and thank you for making some time for some philosophy.